Hello, I would like to welcome you to our first lecture, Hauntings, Poltergeists, and Apparitions, Some History and Theories. Long before there were TV ghost hunters, there was this guy, Pliny. Ghosts have been around for a very, very long time. They are mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Matthew, it talks about Jesus walking across the stormy waters towards a boat that his disciples were in. They were convinced that they were seeing a ghost. Also in the Old Testament, in the book of Samuel, Saul is consulting Samuel's ghost through a medium and has a conversation with Samuel. And he was convinced that this was some sort of apparition of Samuel that he was talking to since he had been long dead. You find ghosts in Egyptian history. The Ankh was one type of ghost where they believed that part of the soul wandered around the Egyptian tomb if it was in disarray and could do harm or good to the living. In fact, relatives of the dead in these situations would manipulate these ghosts to put curses on people that they didn't like, to put curses on their enemies. The first picture that I showed you was Pliny alongside the ghost hunters, Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman lawyer that liked to collect ghost stories. And one of them that he wrote about was to his friend Linnaeus, and it was about some experiences that he had with a ghostly woman that had chains on her. And if you have seen some of the old movies, especially like A Christmas Carol, where one of the ghosts had a long chain attached to him, that's where this idea came from, was stories that Pliny talked about having chains with ghosts. That's where that connection is. Later on, Joseph Glanville in 1662, he also liked to collect ghost stories. He was English, and one of the ones that he really was intrigued by was the drummer of Tedworth. I encourage you to look it up. They had some really interesting illustrations on that of demons flying around the top of the house and trying to come down the chimney. Basically, that one was the story of a criminal who was very annoying and played this drum very loudly within the town, and the judge decided to confiscate his drum. Well, that was a big mistake because the drummer put a curse on the drum, and when the judge took the drum home, it would not stop playing, and all kinds of paranormal activity started happening. Ghosts and demons were floating around, and the drum would not stop drumming, and nobody really knows what happened to the drum, but the judge did at some point get rid of it, and we really don't know what happened to the original criminal. He kind of was lost to history as well. But mainly what I want you to get from these stories is that ghosts and their hunters have been around for a very, very long time. And if you look into just the history of any civilization, you are going to find information and stories on paranormal activity and especially ghostly activity. This is nothing new. And I want to give you a quick note here. I am in Texas, so my lectures are going to be focused around things that go on here in the United States. And I know that there are many other things in many other countries that go on paranormally, but this is what I am most familiar with. So starting here, spiritualism and the Fox sisters are what really started the kind of the beginnings of not necessarily scientific, but systematic investigations into paranormal activity, into ghostly activity. Basically, what you've got here is in upstate New York, you had the Fox family, who moved into a so-called haunted house, and the daughters began communicating with spirits through snapping. They would snap their fingers and try to communicate with spirits, and then eventually started talking to spirits that they thought were in the house through rapping, through knocking, 1 for yes, 2 for no, that sort of thing. They were convinced that they had found the ghost of a 31-year-old man who'd been murdered and buried in the cellar. And what I find really interesting about this story is that later on, a wall collapsed in the house, and sure enough, a skeleton was found in the basement of the home. So I thought that was just kind of interesting. I don't know if there was a connection or not, but it just kind of makes you say, that's interesting. Anyway, what was going on in the Fox house with the Fox sisters became very, very popular. In fact, it was the birth of a spiritual movement called spiritualism. That's where people started having seances and having mediums come into their home to talk to the spirits of the dead. That's kind of where this all started here in the United States. The sisters became so popular that they kind of went on the road with their show and commercialized their seances, and unfortunately this was just filled with a lot of fraud. What they were doing on the road wasn't really truly spiritually, it wasn't going, it was just plain out fraud. They were tricking people. Unfortunately, in a lot of situations, if you do a little bit of looking, you will find that genuine paranormal activity is mixed with fraud, or even genuine parapsychological activity, and we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes, is a combination of fraud and genuine ability, and it makes it very difficult to tell the difference between the two. And unfortunately, it is really kind of a smear on the entire field of paranormal investigation and parapsychology, and has been probably since the beginning. After the Fox sisters, though, things did start taking an actual scientific turn. That is when the Society for Psychical Research started in 1882, and this was in Britain. And what happened was this type of activity got the attention of scientists and philosophers. Henry Sidgwick, who's the man here in the slide, was the first president of SPR, and he was a philosophy professor at Cambridge. The group also drew physicists, mathematicians, and more philosophers. They created a 2-volume work. It's called Phantasms of the Living, and yes, you are still able to get that on Amazon if you type that in. And it's a compilation of 700 cases of spontaneous telepathy, ESP, and ghostly activity. So this is really where things started to be studied systematically and scientifically by actual scholars. And I'm happy to say that the Society for Psychical Research is still going strong today, and I highly recommend them as a good resource for paranormal investigation and paranormal research. An offshoot of that was the American Society for Psychical Research. It started in 1885, and it too applied scientific methods to paranormal investigations. So back in the 1800s, we had people that were already deciding to study this type of phenomenon scientifically and systematically. Later on in the mid-1900s, in 1935, Duke University created a parapsychology lab. It was run by J.B. and Louisa Rhine. That was his wife. and they studied what they called spontaneous cases of psi, or I like to call it psi in the wild, whether that be telepathy, psychokinesis, ESP, or ghostly activity. All of these things are very, very much intertwined. That's why I keep bringing parapsychology into this, and you'll see how they're connected as we go through this course. And the parapsychology lab started because JB and Louisa Rhine were wanting to defraud mediums. If you remember, just a few minutes ago, I was talking about the birth of spiritualism. Well, by this time, it was a pretty big deal, and you had mediums all over the place having seances with families and groups of people, and most of the time they weren't too reputable. If you want to look up some what are now kind of funny pictures, but at the time were not very funny pictures, they were, in the early days of photography, look up ectoplasm, photographs of ectoplasm, and you will see how some of these mediums were defrauding people. Louisa Rhine, JB's wife and co-researcher, decided to collect cases of spontaneous psi, kind of like what the Society for Psychical Research did earlier on. And in this situation, she focused mostly on ghostly activity. People who knew about the parapsychology lab would write in and tell her about all these strange paranormal experiences they were having in their homes. And so she did not have the resources, and honestly, she did not have the desire to go out to these homes to find out what was going on herself. However, she collected their stories and hoped that they would give her enough information to possibly study some things in a laboratory situation. And you have to keep in mind, JB and Louisa were hardcore researchers. They were more interested in trying to conduct experiments in controlled laboratory situations. They were not interested in the messy real world where these things happened on a pretty regular basis. The parapsychology lab is still running. It is not part of Duke University, but it is on the Duke University campus. It is now the Rhine Research Center, and they are still doing research into these types of things. They have a bioenergy laboratory that they've been doing studies in on how ultraviolet light may be able to carry psychic abilities and psychic volition, through ultraviolet light. Maybe healers might be able to heal. It's a very interesting area of study that is, once again, related. I highly recommend them. They have courses for those that are interested in parapsychology and in paranormal investigation, and a lot of good online information. So the Rhine Research Center is another good source to kind of have on hand if you're very interested in learning more. Harry Price, I mention him because he is kind of the precursor to the way ghost hunters ghost hunt today. If you've watched any of the TV shows, you basically have a group or a few people going into a reportedly haunted house or situation, and they've got the cameras rolling and the recorders rolling, and they are giving a blow-by-blow to the public on what's going on. What is going on here? Oh my goodness, I'm seeing a ghost here, or I'm seeing an apparition there, that type of thing. It makes for some very interesting and very entertaining TV. Well, Harry was around before television, but he would do the exact same thing on radio. And like our ghost hunters today, he was very much of the idea that, you know what, I want the people out of here. I want the witnesses out of here. I want the place to myself because, or to me and my team, because I want to experience these activities, these paranormal activities firsthand. I don't want any interference from anyone else. And there again, you see that in a lot of investigations and how they're done today. He investigated the most haunted house, at least it was had a reputation as the most haunted house in England, the Borley Rectory in 1929. And he also investigated one of my favorite paranormal stories, and that was Jeff. I know it's G-E-F, but it was pronounced Jeff. The mongoose said so himself. Jeff the Talking Mongoose in 1935. Another story I really encourage you to look up. It was very interesting and caught my attention as a 9-year-old girl reading through books of spooky stories. Basically, a family in England that lived on a farmhouse. They had what they thought was a mongoose living in their walls that would talk to the family, and it had a pretty dirty mouth. It would say some things that were pretty salty, and as well as it would sing songs, and it would interact with the family on a regular basis. Harry Price investigated this case, and he did not see Jeff, and really he didn't see much of anything. But later on, the family moved out, and there was a dead animal that looked a little bit like a mongoose on the property found a little bit later, and the house unfortunately has now been torn down. But another fun, kind of interesting story. To this day, nobody really knows what was going on in that situation. They became very famous. People would come to the house and try to see Jeff or hear Jeff, and we don't know if it was a poltergeist or some sort of apparitional type activity. We just don't know, but still, it was a very interesting story. Then we go on to our EVP pioneers. For those of you who don't know, EVP stands for electronic voice phenomena. What that is, that's very common in paranormal investigations. And instead of hearing a voice or someone talking, a disembodied voice with your ears, you have a recorder on, and then you hear somebody talking on the recorder later when you play it back. And that is an EVP, or electronic voice phenomena. Some pioneers: Friedrich Jurgensen just happened upon this in 1959. He was out recording birds and caught human voices on playback, even though he was out in the woods and there was nobody else around, and he thought that was very interesting. In fact, he thought one of the voices was the voice of his mother. Konstantin Raudive also started collecting EVPs and worked with Jurgensen for quite a long time, and he used white noise to help hear the voices clear. So he would be playing white noise and then turning on his recorder and recording these voices. He created I think it was an album called Breakthrough in 1968. I know he wrote about it as well, but if you would like to learn more about Raudive and his pioneering EVP work, I encourage you to look up Breakthrough, and that was in 1968 when that came out. Andrew Green, we're back over at the UK again. Andrew Green was a journalist, and he spent 60 years investigating the paranormal and never once saw a ghost. I thought that was very interesting. He used scientific, systematic methods and in his investigations, and eventually wrote a book, Ghost Hunting: A Practical Guide. This was in 1973, and it was the first book dedicated to scientific ghost hunting. So this is a little more specific. It's not just scientific writings or books on parapsychology that happen to include ghostly activity. This was specifically written on ghost hunting. So there's another book for you to look up and take a look at if you're interested. Then, not much later than that, again in England, we had the case of the Enfield Poltergeist. The movie Conjuring 2 was based on this case study of these girls that had a lot of poltergeist activity happening around them in this home, again in England. I also have a link to a documentary by the BBC on the Enfield Poltergeist a little bit later here in the PowerPoint. The ASSAP also came into being in 1981. That is the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomenon. Again, another British organization. They are still around and doing very good work, and I encourage you to look them up. I have them in the resources part of this course, and doing very good, systematic, and scientific work in the field of paranormal investigation. And of course, like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the Rhine Research Center is still going. It was officially founded in 1995, but really it was just the Duke Parapsychology Laboratory moving off into its own building, but still conducting parapsychological research. The Society for Psychical Research, as I mentioned before, continues to work with universities and research the survival of consciousness. Most people out there, if you ask them what a ghost is, they're going to say it's a dead person. Well, believe it or not, there is a huge debate that continues to rage in academic circles about whether or not our consciousness, our personality, what makes us us, survives after death. So there are many, many theories out there about what ghosts may be if they are not dead people. Well, the Society for Psychical Research is continuing to do a lot of work in this area to see if there is survival after death, the survival of our consciousness, who we are after death. It's one of humanity's biggest questions. I don't know that we'll ever be able to answer it, but if we do, oh my goodness, that is like hitting the lottery of questions for mankind. The Rhine Research Center it has the Journal of Parapsychology, and I highly recommend that if you would like to read scientific studies on parapsychology and the paranormal. And like I mentioned earlier, they are still doing work in their bioenergy lab on ultraviolet light and parapsychological abilities such as ESP or healing or psychokinesis. The University of Virginia, it also has a perceptual studies department. This is very, very interesting. For many years, they have been studying young children. And related to reincarnation, they're finding that some children, very young, 3, 4, 5 years old, have information about people that have lived in the past, and they are able to verify this. Some of these children have the same phobias as these people who've lived in the past, birthmarks, no accurate facts about the person who has passed, and accurate memories of the person who has passed. And they're finding that these memories, at least, and the facts fade in the children when they reach about 7 years old. It's a fascinating area of study, and how these children know these things about these people who have died is a big mystery, and one that is being studied at the University of Virginia. Of course, popular media, there has been a surge, I would say probably over the last 10 to 15 years in amateur paranormal investigating. It's one of the reasons why I put together this class. I am one of those amateur paranormal investigators that decided to learn a lot more about the field and do some professional learning from the Rhine Research Center, and then start teaching, these classes on my own. There's been good and bad about this. Some paranormal investigating groups do a great job and collect data and find some very interesting things and help people through some very difficult, scary situations. But there are some that really use TV shows and movies as a template for what they're doing in the field. And I have to tell you, that's not a good idea. These ghost hunting shows are great for entertainment. They're fun to watch, but they are not a good how-to guide for actual paranormal investigation. And we will talk more about that as we go on in this course. So what's going on here? What exactly is paranormal activity? What is a haunting? What is an apparition? And what is a poltergeist? And what are the differences between them? Hauntings, they are also referred to as place memory, are usually related to locations, buildings, or objects. They're usually they're repetitive, and they aren't interactive, and they represent a time or an event that happened in the past. I call them, if you see at the bottom here, nature's DVR player. It's almost like we don't exactly know how this works, but our best guess so far is that somehow in the environment something has recorded a past event and played it back. That's the best we've got. It's a working theory, but people, that go to, old castles or, old battleships, and, for, Gettysburg, where the Battle of Gettysburg took place, is a good place to experience these residual type things, because they would, people go there and they hear things like men screaming or cannon fire, or basically like a battle is going on, and people hear this over and over and over again. It's not interactive. There aren't the ghosts of soldiers coming up to tourists and saying, "How do you do? My name is Jeb." It's just the sounds and the sights and the feelings of something that happened in the past that was very, very traumatic, and it happens over and over again. So we're finding that it is usually something that either has to do with a very traumatic event, like a battle or a murder in a home, or something very emotionally charged or very repetitive. I had a case not that long ago where the grandmother in the family had passed, and I talked to the family about that, and they said, in the evenings we see grandma, the ghost of grandma, walking across the living room and through the kitchen and out to the backyard. And this happens a lot. She doesn't interact with anybody. She doesn't say hello. She just walks across the room, through the kitchen, out into the backyard. I happened to look out into the backyard, and I saw what looked like a little garden plot. And so I asked them, I said, did Grandma like to garden? And they said, oh, she loved her garden. She was always out there. And so what that tells me is that Grandma walked across the living room, through the kitchen, and out to her garden many, many times during her life. And so this somehow emotionally imprinted in the environment. And there was nothing horrible or scary. The family loved the fact that they could see Grandma's ghost walking through the house out to the garden. They weren't scared at all. They said it was peaceful and kind of nice. And it was just something that happened so many times during her life. It was almost kind of like a groove was created. And so that can be the result of a residual haunting as well. It's a type of what we call psychometry, and this is where people who are, and like I said, we'll learn more about this here in just a minute. It's the ability to read objects or read a house, like a haunted house. It's just a big object. Read the past, read the energy, and some people are better able to pick up on this than others. A lot of psychics are able to see things and hear things and read the building. I was on a recent investigation at an old hotel that had been closed down, and I was sitting next to a psychic, and I am not psychic at all. And so I asked her, we're sitting on the stage of a big open ballroom or kind of an auditorium. And I asked her, I said, what's going on? And she said, nothing bad. I'm just seeing people dancing. There's music, and there's dancing, and there's talking. It's just a party, and there's the room is crowded. And she was seeing this, and she was hearing this in her mind's eye. She was practicing psychometry. She was reading the building. She was reading this past energy that was paranormal, but it wasn't anything traumatic or scary. It was just, this is what happened in the past, and I'm able to pick up on it. So what's the recorder? That's kind of the $1 million question. We really don't know what the recorder is, but one thing, at least I'm finding with the more research I'm doing personally and the more reading I'm doing on folks who are much smarter than me and have much better equipment than me that are in the scientific community, we are seeing that there are strange magnetic field readings in a lot of these haunt type situations. So the best we can say for now is that there seems to be a correlation between odd magnetic field readings and these haunting phenomena. And that's the best we can say for now. Hauntings, these type of phenomena, and psi. Psi is the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet. It means unknown. So if you hear me refer to psi, it's kind of short for, psychic type abilities. And that's what it's referred to in a lot of the literature, these psi abilities, which are psychokinesis, telepathy, ESP, clairvoyance, precognition, all of those. And you can see Peter Bankman there holding up a Zener card. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in some later lectures. But as I just mentioned, it is the ability for some people to unconsciously pick through the environment and pick up on these imprints of the past that have been left. I find this very fascinating. I think it's very, very interesting. And it's not always visual, it's not always grandma walking across the living room. In the case of Gettysburg that I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's cannon fire, it's cries of the wounded. In some people, it's just overwhelming emotion, whether, it be sadness or fear. They are just overcome with waves of emotion from these situations. So skeptics will look at this and say, well, maybe these are hallucinations. Maybe this is all in people's heads, that they're really not seeing anything at all. This is a bunch of nonsense. Well, that can be very easily checked. You can do historical fact checks, and we're going to be talking about that again in some later lectures, and how important it is to study history when it comes to paranormal investigating. And also ruling out natural causes. Sometimes there are situations where people are hallucinating, and it can be very dangerous. I remember hearing a story one time about a family who was experiencing apparitions and paranormal type activity in their home, and it comes to find out they had a carbon monoxide leak in their home, and they were just getting very, very sick. So another thing that should always be taken into consideration in paranormal investigating is looking for natural causes, because it could be harmful to those that are working in the building or on the property, or those that are living in the home. And it's also very important, because of that, to have a kind of a go-to list of outside folks that you can refer them to, electricians, people from the gas company, foundation repair folks, plumbers, whatever it is, because sometimes natural things that can be going on in the house that people might attribute to paranormal activity could be dangerous or could be harmful to those that are there. So it's always good to check that out and make sure that everything is okay. Apparitions. Apparitions are a different story. I'm going to take a quick sip of water here. Apparitions are what most people think of as your traditional ghost. They are conscious, thinking entities that interact with the living. And most of the people that report seeing apparitions say they just look like regular folks. They don't look like Casper over here on the right, and they aren't usually filmy or, look all shadowy. They just think they're a regular person. I have seen an apparition. It was not interactive, so I'm not sure if it was conscious or thinking. But on a recent investigation at a haunted theater, we were in the basement, and there was some other investigators down there, and the light down there was dim, but it wasn't completely dark. And there was an investigator over in the corner of the basement, and he was looking down at one of his instruments. It was a millimeter that records temperature and EVPs. And so I just looked up and saw there was another man standing behind him, and he was of medium build. He had dark hair, he had a light shirt on and dark pants, and I thought, well, okay, he's just somebody else that's investigating here. And I didn't think too much about it, but then I saw the man, I watched him, he stepped out from behind the investigator with the millimeter and walked towards me and disappeared. I honestly thought he was just an actual person until the point in time that he just vanished into thin air. So there are many, many accounts that are like that of apparitional activity. These things look like normal, solid people much of the time, and they are not always wearing old-timey Victorian clothes either. In the case of my sighting, it was just a very modern man, just somebody that you would see on the street. So, of course, there are all kinds of theories. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. They're swirling around out there, but here are 4 of the main theories on apparitions. Number 1, they're dead people. This is probably the most commonly believed theory, is that these are folks that for whatever reason are hanging around here in our realm and not moving on, or something that we don't understand, but the dead are here, and in rare situations, and I will say that apparitional activity, genuine apparitional activity, is very rare. If you watch the TV shows, they make you think that it happens all the time. It really doesn't. Think of Andrew Green, who went 60 years without seeing any kind of apparitional activity. So dead folks, that's very common. Well, they look like dead folks. A lot of times we can confirm that, oh, gee, that lady sure looks like, Auntie so-and-so or grandma, walking through the living room. So that's one, that is one theory. Crisis apparitions. These are very interesting. The person is actually not dead. These are apparitions that come usually to family members at a time of crisis. For example, I've heard stories of somebody sitting at home, asleep in their chair, and they're suddenly awoken and they see a son or a daughter standing right before them, even though the son or daughter hasn't lived at home for years, and saying, Mom, help, help me, Dad, help, I need help. And then they find out that their son or daughter has been in a car accident and is in the hospital. And so that there's been some very big crisis that has happened in this person's life, and they have somehow reached out in a conscious way, not bodily, but consciously, to a loved one to let them know that they are in crisis. Something bad has happened. These are very, very common. In fact, I have talked to so many people that have had a crisis apparition experience. Deathbed apparitions, again, these are very common. Hospice nurses report these quite a bit. I remember my grandfather when he was in the hospital and was very, very close to passing. He got to the point where his nurses would come into the room and say, oh, here, did you see my brother? Did you meet my brother? He was just here to visit. And of course, his brother had been dead for many, many years. We really don't know what this is. We don't know. I've heard the term the thinning of the veil between life and death. It becomes thin as people come close to passing, and that they are able to see their loved ones or visit with their loved ones. We don't exactly know what's going on, but it seems to be a very comforting thing. So my best guess is that whatever's going on here is a way to ease the passing into death, with loved ones nearby who have already gone before. Living apparitions. This is another one where these are more commonly called out-of-body experiences, where people will, perhaps go into the hospital and have a heart attack and, not really completely pass all the way, but then will float outside of their body and are able to see the operating room and the doctors and hear the conversations and what's going on, but then survive whatever it was that they were in the hospital for. So these out-of-body experiences are another way that people might experience apparitional activity. So apparitions and psi. Here again, we have that connection. Some people are just really wired up for this. They are wired up to see and experience haunting or place memory, activity, as well as apparitional activity. And this is what's interesting about apparitional activity. If there is an apparition in the room, there are people who experience it in different ways. Some might see the person, some might smell the person's perfume if it's a lady, or a cigar. Cigar smoke is very common. Some don't. Some might hear phantom footsteps. They might hear the person walking around. That's why it's believed so far, here again, another working theory, that apparitions are pure consciousness. There's really no physical body. And one of my teachers at the Rhine asked kind of a funny question, but where do ghosts get their clothes? I mean, you don't see ghosts walking around with dead, rotting, putrid grave clothes. And so they're not physical. They are something that is not physical, and they can be experienced in other ways. And it's almost like they are projecting an image of how they want to be perceived. Again, this is all just speculation. We don't know for certain, but it appears that they are not flesh and blood people that have come back. They aren't zombies, and they can, of course, do things that people that have physical bodies can't do. You know, walking through walls and doors and disappearing and reappearing, and so it's very interesting and puzzling, and there again something that we are still working on trying to figure out. One theory is that they are actually not physically communicating because they don't have actual physical clothes, they don't have actual physical bodies, so it goes to follow they don't have an actual physical mouth to speak with. So, well, how are they communicating? They're somehow communicating telepathically, mind to mind. And even though we might hear them say something that we think we're hearing with our ears, it is most likely we are hearing something with our mind. And I know that that's confusing and it's kind of out there, but you know, it kind of follows. You know, if something doesn't have a mouth to speak with, a physical mouth to speak with, it's not going to send sound waves through the air for us to hear. And they can manipulate the environment through psychokinesis. I do believe that they are able to, you know, manipulate recorders and maybe cause those electronic voice phenomena that we talked about earlier. They could cause poltergeist type activity where objects move, and you know, you have a room full of people and they see a lamp slide across a table, and you know, an apparition might be able to cause that. So they do have control, or it appears that they have control over energy, over physical energy, to move things or cause imprints or to manifest in other ways. So there again, these are all just a lot of good head scratching questions, but that's why I love this. These are big mysteries, and people have been working on them for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's fun to be a part of that. Poltergeist comes from the term noisy ghost. In most cases, it says here on the slide, it's not really a ghost at all. It is something called reoccurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. In a lot of poltergeist cases, it is usually a flesh and blood human being causing the activity. Sometimes it can be an apparition, like I just mentioned. They seem to be, in rare cases, able to manipulate the environment, but most of the time it is somebody that is unconsciously manipulating the environment because of stress and anxiety and chaos in the home. And so, you know, it's a way of blowing off steam. I mean, some people go out and take a run. Some people go eat some ice cream. Well, people that are psi gifted in psychokinesis, they may be able to throw a lamp across the room, but not really know that they're doing it. There are plenty of cases out there that, you know, I was thinking one case of a bar worker, and all kinds of poltergeist activity would happen whenever it was her shift, and whenever she would go home, the activity would stop. It eventually got so bad that the owner had to let her go, and once she was let go, the poltergeist activity stopped completely. And so it was highly suspected that the activity in that bar was not due to ghosts or a haunt or paranormal activity at all. It was due to this woman who was unconsciously manipulating the environment with her mind, which there again is also just kind of freaky and interesting to think about, but that's something else to study. Poltergeist activity is usually limited in duration. It's something that happens over a course of weeks or months, and then it kind of burns out. There was one study done where a third of people that were surveyed were found to have epilepsy that had poltergeist activity happen around them. It's a possible connection. Don't know for certain. If you'd like to know about a really famous poltergeist case, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's the Enfield poltergeist. I have a link here in the PowerPoint, but you can just go to YouTube and type in Enfield poltergeist, and you're going to find all kinds of information on that particular case. And there's a documentary on it, so it's worth a watch. So poltergeists, maybe a ghost, maybe not. Yes, and I mentioned this, poltergeists and psi, it's a type of psychokinesis, whether it's caused by a person or whether it's caused by an apparition. Most of the time, it's going to be caused by a person. And believe it or not, belief plays an important role. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute when I get to the Philip experiment. That's what these folks are a part of here on the right. The activity stops when a person realizes, oh my goodness, I'm doing this. And they usually can get counseling and learn how to do meditation exercises and just, get out of a bad situation, and hopefully, the activity will calm down and then eventually stop. Apparitional psi, there again, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, could be a possible cause of audio and video anomalies. They could be manipulating energy to cause, video shadow people, things that people catch on video, and also, like I said, EVPs, the electronic voice phenomenon. They may be able to manipulate that so that people can hear these EVP recordings due to apparitions. The Philip experiment, I thought, was very interesting, and this group of researchers, I also have a link in the resources on the Philip experiment. They decided to create a poltergeist, and so they did this backstory on Philip, and he lived in the 1600s, I believe, and had this very tragic love story, and there's all kinds of death and mayhem, and they drew a picture of him, and they believed that he existed. They were saying, and I guess believed that he existed is not really the best way to put it. Basically, they were going to say, you know what, we've created Philip. He is going to come into being. We're going to believe that he is going to come into being. And they were able to bring Philip into being. And he would communicate with them through raps and knocks on these tables and move the table. And they knew he was a product of their minds. He wasn't a real person that lived at one time. Nonetheless, their belief in their creation brought it to fruition. And so I thought that was very interesting. It's a very interesting experiment, and something that if you're interested in poltergeists and psychokinesis and how that all kind of comes together, I encourage you to look at the Philip experiment. Okay, that is the end of our first lecture. If you choose to do the assignment, here it is. I want you to take a minute to think about a ghostly encounter that you've either had or heard of, and what kind of encounter do you think it was? Do you think it was a haunting, an apparition, or a poltergeist, or something else? And I would like you to explain that as the assignment for this lecture. Thank you, and I look forward to talking to you more about this topic in our next lecture.